Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this episode. We're going to be talking about remote leadership. What are the challenges that come up? And there are a couple things that I wanted to do on this workshop that we're going to be on. It's probably about, I would say, 25 minutes. I wanted to talk about the challenges that we face in regards to um, leading remotely. And it's interesting that I've looked at this both from the standpoint of what are the challenges for the employee, but also what are the challenges for the leader. And many of them are the same. They're a little different in how they're worded, but I think they're very much the same challenges. So I'm going to talk really about 6 or 7 here that are probably the biggest challenges that I've run into or I'm seeing. One is around communication, one is around engagement, one is around collaboration, one is around productivity, the next is technology, mental health, and the last is also how do we do career development when it comes to that. As I'm going through this, you'll see in the chat I've put in 2 different links. One is a link to 8 questions that you can ask that will outline the cables behaviors that I work from and give you an idea in terms of how do you show up as a leader. The second will outline a leadership academy that I use with a lot of my clients that's based on a number of different modules, and I coach people over a period of months in groups on how to do that. So feel free to download either one of those to take a look at them. Um, there are a couple things as we go through this. I wanted to first lay out what are the challenges, right? Those 7 challenges, and there might be others. Please, if you are experiencing anything different, leave it in the chat and I'll try and get to those, or DM me on my LinkedIn page, and I will certainly get back to you in regards to what are some of the solutions that can help to overcome that. I love having these conversations. So, um, 2 things that I want to talk about though is one is called the SCARF model, and I want to talk about how that model. I think I've been using it for a decade now. I think in the last 3 years since COVID, it's become even more relevant. And we're going to talk about 5 social needs that we all have. And that when these social needs are either met or unmet, we either are in a place where we would say there's reward, we move toward an organization or a leader, and when they're not satisfied, we move away from that. And how important that is to understand what these social needs are. And when we understand these 5 social needs, and are there others? Certainly. But I think these 5 I have found to be the most prominent, and they continue to play out. As I work with organizations and individuals, I will constantly be working with the leaders that I'm working with to discuss how is the situation that you're having right now playing out as it relates to social needs, and it's a way to really sort of pull it back to what are the social needs. So it's a model that was created by David Rock, who is a neuroscientist out of Australia, and it was he really introduced it. I believe it was probably in 2008. And again, it's based on 5 social needs that we all have and the impact that these have on us, that they're almost as important as our need for food or water when they're satisfied or unsatisfied. So SCARF stands for an acronym. The first one is around status. And status really is about not a title, but more or less relative importance. How do I feel as it relates to who I report to or this organization? Do I feel as though I'm respected? I am appreciated for what I do, and how important that is for us to understand that. The next is around um, certainty, that we have a need to feel um, that we understand how things are going to play out. And if you think about the last 3 years from a standpoint of certainty, especially from remote work, it continues to shift, right? What is this going to look like? What are the expectations? And when we're unclear as to um, the level of certainty, what are the rules of the road almost, then our level of disengagement probably increases. The next is around autonomy in this SCARF model. So we dealt with status, we dealt with certainty. Autonomy is the next one. And if you think about this, even though we might work for somebody else or we have certain job descriptions, we all want to feel as though we have some control over our destiny. And I think that certainly plays out in a remote work environment. And if we think about those 7 challenges that I talked about, we'll talk about where those might fit. The next one that we talk about is relatedness, our feeling of a sense of belonging or connection, right? When we don't have that, what happens? And we can certainly think of especially the last 3 years when we had mandatory isolation on some levels, how damaging that was. And I look at a lot of the things that have gone on over the last 3 years and our level of intolerance toward each other. I believe a lot of it comes down to the isolation that we've all been under. That the longer we go without being in groups or around each other, I think the more damaging that has become. And I'll leave that for another workshop because I think that is a topic in and of itself. How isolation has really impacted our ability to tolerate one another. So the next one that we move on to after relatedness is about fairness, and we can think about fairness too in this environment. That when when some people have an easier time remote work or scheduling that versus others that are need to be in the office more or in their environment, they don't have the ability to be flexible or work remotely. That can start to create environments where people feel as though there's a lack of fairness within an organization. So important for us to remember. So those are the 5 social needs that we have. And when we talk about the challenges that leaders face working remotely, it's important to understand how those 5 social needs play into things like communication and engagement. I want to talk about cables first, and then we'll go through and I'll break out how Scarf and how cables impact both. Just like Scarf identifies the social needs that we need to address or aren't being addressed, cables is a research model that I used consistently with my clients that it helps them understand what are the behaviors that you need to demonstrate consistently. And think about it in terms of building bridges with those people that you work with. That the stronger your bridge becomes, the more you demonstrate these cables consistently, the stronger that bridge will become in terms of your ability to navigate these challenges that you're being faced with, right? So the first cable in cables is around congruence and consistency, right? It's about walking the talk. Is what we say and what we do the same thing? As an organization, as a leader, am I walking the talk myself? So important for us to recognize. The next one is around collaboration, or I'm sorry, the next one is around appreciation. It's about recognizing people not only for who they are, the diversity that they bring to our team, but also recognizing people for the input, the efforts that they do. And I think that can be even more important in a remote environment. Um, Letting people know how much you appreciate what they're doing. Right. So the B in cables is around belongingness, and it ties into what we talk about in relatedness. It's creating an environment where people feel connected to the organization or to the leader or to the team. When we don't have that, we lack collaboration. The next one is around listening in our cables model that we talk about these behaviors on how important it is to demonstrate listening. And I talk about listening in 4 different sort of components. One is we listen with our eyes, we watch for body language, we watch for facial expressions. The next, we listen with our ears. We listen for tone of voice, the speed that potentially somebody speaks at, the word choice that they use can also become very important. The next 2 I think are really important in this environment, especially in a remote setting, is we listen with our mind. And that is about listening with curiosity. What is the other person trying to say? Not that long ago, I interviewed a gentleman, Oscar Trimboli, who's an expert in listening. He wrote a book called How to Listen that I had on my podcast, Learning from Leaders. And he talked about 2 numbers, 125 and 900. And 125 is the rate at which we generally speak, 125 words a minute. We think or process at about 900 words a minute. And I think that's really important for us to think, right? And I always sort of do this, like imagine it's a bubble over your head. That sometimes we've probably all been in those situations where we say something and then after we say it, we're like, you know what? That's actually not what I meant to say. It's because those 900 words up here Some get out ahead of our being able to process what we really wanted to say. And that's that moment where somebody says, "That's not really what I meant. Let me rephrase that." Or we write something down and then we rewrite it because we're like, "That doesn't sound exactly like what I wanted to say." I think it's important to think of that from the standpoint of listening with our mind. It's giving somebody else the benefit that maybe some of those 900 words that were up here isn't exactly what they meant to say. And it gives us an opportunity to clarify. I might say, "Jim or Sue, what I heard you just say is this. Is this what you meant?" And it gives them an opportunity to clarify that. The next one is when we listen with our heart or with empathy. And this is simply about role reversal. Imagine if the conversation were reversed. How would you want this other person to be listening to you? Now, when we listen in all four of those components with our ears, our eyes, our mind, and our heart, we have very little else that we can do. We can't multitask when we're doing that. And to me, when we're listening from a standpoint of curiosity and empathy, especially, we're listening with the other person's perspective, which then provides us an opportunity to gain a greater understanding of what they're actually trying to tell us. The next one in our cables model is the E, and that's around empathy by itself. Imagining what it's like to be remote, to be in an environment where somebody else is, and the challenges that they might be facing. How do we do that? And to understand that. And then the last one in the cables model that we talk about from a standpoint of behaviors is around specifics or setting clear expectations and how important that is for us to set clear expectations and hold each other accountable to those clear expectations. That can be the second part of that. So again, I mentioned a link that's in the chat here. If you go or just below my picture, my LinkedIn profile, there are 8 questions. It's a short PDF that you can use to challenge yourself. Where am I on these 6 behaviors? And it's 8 questions because 2 of the behaviors actually have 2 different components to it, but it all deals with cables. So here we are. We've talked about the social needs that we have in regards to SCARF. We've also talked about the cables behaviors. What are those behaviors that we can demonstrate that will address the challenges that SCARF identifies in those remote challenges? So if we think about it from the standpoint, and as I said, I wrote down some notes here just so I made sure that I could connect on some of these. From the standpoint of communication as it relates to SCARF, right? We can talk about certainty, how important that is for individuals to understand what's the environment that I'm in, and is this an environment where I feel as though I understand what the rules of the road are when we're communicating. Listening or providing autonomy is one of those others that can come out in regards to communication. When we are communicating, do I feel as though I'm valued in what's going on in this conversation? Am I being drawn into the conversation? So communication can also bring in relatedness into it as a scarf domain that needs to be addressed from the standpoint of communication. The next one is around engagement, right? And if this is a challenge from a standpoint of remote, again, this is where status can come into play here as well. If people don't feel as though they're valued or appreciated as remote employees as they're listening in, then they're going to become disengaged. They're not going to listen. The other again is around autonomy, is having people be able to weigh into what the conversations are, how important that is. Not that long ago, I was doing a remote workshop, but I also had 30 individuals that were on site. And somebody that was remote had chimed in about not being able to hear that well in terms of the dialogue that was going on. And to me, that's a sense of this individual probably felt on some level their own status, their worth in terms of, or also their relatedness in terms of being part of the group was diminished because the technology, which is one of the challenges that we talk about, was not really addressed well enough that they felt like they were part of the group. The audio that was going around, and we were talking 30 of us in the group, was not able to transfer strongly enough to those on a remote setting. So that's how technology can still come into play on this. So the next one we talk about is collaboration, right? That's a challenge from a remote standpoint. How do we create collaboration? in this environment. And that's where, again, the status of relatedness comes in, right? When people don't feel as though they're connected to the group, they're not going to want to collaborate. They're not going to feel as though they have the ability to collaborate. Technology is the next one that we talk about. And, I just mentioned that story. We can think about it from the standpoint of certainty that can come into play here. Is that if people don't feel as though the technology is reliable that they're on, if they're going to be able to be heard or listen to what's going on or be able to speak to the group, then that's going to be impacted. Another one that I mentioned here again, I think is autonomy again can come into play in regards to technology, and maybe not feeling as though you have the opportunity to um, have any role in what the development is for the group on remote calls. The next one we talk about is mental health. And we know from the standpoint, as I mentioned earlier on this, isolation, how impactful that can be, or how detrimental when we don't have the ability to connect. Isolation really has such a damaging impact on our mental health. From a scarf model, we talk about it from the standpoint of relatedness. When we don't feel as though we're connected to the group, right? Our mental health is going to be impacted. And I would argue that a number of the challenges that we talk about can also come into play here. That it could be the status could be impacted, that I don't feel as though anybody really cares about my well-being or mental health. The person that I report to doesn't feel that they're that interested in it. It's important for us to recognize that. Um, Last one is around career development. And I know that some might be thinking, well, this is more of an employee thing. I do think it's both the leader and the employee. In a remote environment, career development is really so vital in terms of understanding, I think, from the standpoint of status. Do I feel as though um, I'm respected? I'm part of this group in terms of relatedness. When we don't have those things, certainty also comes into play. How will I get promoted? What is career development for somebody that is on a remote um, environment or more of a remote environment? How does that play into it? So that's how, when we talk about those 7 challenges that come up, that's how SCARF can play into that. So next, we want to talk about the behaviors. What are the behaviors that can also address each one of these? Right. So from the standpoint of communication, what are some of the cables behaviors that I mentioned to you earlier that can come into play? So communication can be around congruence, walk in the talk. As a leader, have I set the stage on what's going to be the expectation for remote interactions and consistency of that? And if I'm not following through on that, right, I've broken that trust with my team in terms of what's this going to look like? How are we going to make sure that those that are remote and those that are in person, we're all having equal ability to communicate our concerns? That's where specifics, as I mentioned, comes into play. So next, around engagement, we can talk about it from the standpoint of appreciation, right? When we're recognizing people that are remote for what they're doing, for their efforts, I think that becomes really important. And also, from an engagement standpoint, when we activate the behavior of creating belongingness, how important that is for us in this situation. So next, we talk about collaboration. Well, how does that come into play? A couple different areas. One, again, is belongingness that we can activate to create collaboration. But the next is around listening, right? That if we really demonstrate listening as a behavior to those people that are remote, then we're going to motivate them in a way that they're going to feel as though they want to collaborate because we're listening to what they're saying. Productivity is the next one. And we can talk about productivity again, I think, from the standpoint of specifics. What do we have for clear expectations? That's specifics. That's in the cables model. What do we need from each other? How important is that for us to lay out? This is what's going to be expected. These are the deadlines that things are going to be needed in. And this is what's going to happen when they're not. I think that goes a long way to eliminating our lack of certainty or uncertainty as we talk about it from SCARF. So the next one, we talk about technology. Again, I think I mentioned that example of speaking to a group in person, but also having people remote and not being able to hear. That comes into play, I think, a lot when you have people that are remote in a group. They're maybe in um, in a conference room, and they're all trying to be involved in a conversation. It can be very difficult to bring people involved in that when they're in a group setting, and I think that's important to talk about that in the sense of listening for one, and also specifics as well, setting clear expectations. Mental health. How do we use cables to help improve mental health? I think there are several that we can do. One is we can create a sense of belongingness, making people feel as though they are connected, that you care about them, right? Empathy becomes important here of demonstrating that. Listening to them becomes really important, and listening from the standpoint of curiosity. So all three of those can be so powerful when we're trying to deal with issues of mental health for individuals. And then lastly, from a standpoint of career development, how do we address that? Right? We can talk about specifics again for people that are remotely working. What things do they need to do to develop as employees? If they want to get promoted, what are the clear expectations that need to be presented to them in terms of here's what you need to do, here's the structure. So important for us to be able to do that. So as I'm recapping here, right, we talked about the seven challenges that we run into, whether it's communication or engagement, collaboration, um, productivity, technology, mental health, and career development. Those are the seven that I've found to be the most relevant out there right now. And again, I think whether it's the employee or the leader of this group, I think they impact both sides differently. The next is we talked about the SCARF model, right? Those five domains of social needs that we have: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And when those are either satisfied, then we have a reward environment where people um, become more engaged, they become more collaborative. When those aren't satisfied, then you have what's called an avoidance behavior where people draw back, they disengage, they pull away. And each one of those social needs impacts on some level one of those challenges that we talked about. So, lastly, we talk about cables again. There are six researched behaviors that you can demonstrate. And when you demonstrate them consistently and apply them, they create an environment where those challenges start to self correct themselves because you're doing things like being congruent and consistent with what you said you're going to do. You're reaching out and demonstrating appreciation, the A in that cables model, for what people do and for who they are, for the personalities and perspectives that they can bring. You create an environment of belongingness, the B in the cables model. You develop connection with the individuals. Next is you demonstrate listening, where you create an environment where people feel as though they're able to speak about the challenges that they're being faced with. And as a listener with all four of those functions that we talked about, you're probably able to come up with much better solutions. Next is around empathy. Again, when we're demonstrating empathy, we're putting ourselves in the place of those remote workers that we have. What are the challenges that are going on for them, and how would we want to be treated? And then lastly, when we have specifics, when we have clear expectations on what's needed, and when we hold each other accountable to those, we have an environment where engagement and motivation and people feeling inspired is elevated just by those six behaviors. And if you think about it this way, that those cables that we create, we're building bridges, either individually with those people that are remotely, but also as a team, we're building stronger bridges, which then impact our organization. So I hope you found this helpful, this valuable. Again, if you can look to the links that I put in the notes here, one will go to the 8 questions that you can ask in terms of your ability to lead, and the other outlines the Cables Leadership Academy that I use with a lot of the clients that I work with. And I'd love if anybody wants to reach out to me outside of this and you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those, any challenges that you might be having personally. And until the next LinkedIn Live that I'm able to do, I hope you're able to go out there and